(480 BC), a narrow mountain pass at Thermopylae, roughly 85 miles northwest of Athens, Greece. It was the time and the place that would forever crystallize the essence of Sparta, in a single event that future generations will turn to again and again as a turning point in history.
What transpired at Thermopylae has been burned in the memory of Western civilization.
Thermopylae was actually a myth enacted in real life. Shakespeare himself could not have concocted more of a classic story.
A phalanx of 7,000 Greek warriors advanced on an invading Persian army of several 100,000. The Greeks were horribly outnumbered, but they pressed on, confident that the 300 men in the front lines could lead them to victory, simply because they were 300 men from Sparta.
A Spartan soldier taken by himself is as good as any other soldier. But you put them together and you've got an army that is better than any army in the world.
Just the sight of the Spartan army's signature lambda emblazoned on a wall of shields was often enough to secure victory.
There was nothing else like it in the world. It was the premier warrior culture of all time in civilized society.
The pitifully outnumbered Greeks miraculously held off the Persian onslaught through 2 days of gruesome combat. Finally, the Spartan king, Leonidas, realized that defeat was inevitable. He ordered thousands of remaining Greek soldiers to run for their lives. But all 300 Spartans stood their ground and fought to the last man, because they were Spartans.
The stand at Thermopylae galvanized Greek morale. It also bloodied the Persians and said to the Persians, "Don't mess with us."
The Spartans' stand at Thermopylae became a classic example of losing the battle, but winning the war.
Thermopylae has remained in history as a code word almost, for the concept of giving one's life even in defiance of death.
These soldiers were willing to fight a losing battle in defense of their virtue and their country. They became the greatest fighting force the world has ever known. It took a unique society to produce such men, men who fought so methodically in the face of impending death.
The Spartans exemplify something that's a very important part of human nature, a drive for purity, a drive for order, a drive for harmony, a drive that gives us the courage not to fear death, and a drive that makes us fight for an ideal such as freedom at any cost.
While today we think of Athens as the birthplace of Western civilization and the high-water mark of Greek culture, it was Sparta that many Golden Age Greeks admired most.
They were really thought of as a kind of an ideal of Greek civilization. But it was a utopia in the sense that it was dedicated to an ideal of virtue, of service to the community, of selflessness and unity.
What the Greek city-state valued most of all was freedom from foreign intervention, a sense of belonging, and success on the battlefield. Sparta was abundant in all three.
During Sparta's reign, ancient Greece was a collection of more than 1,000 self-governing communities called city-states.
A city-state is really a city which functions for all practical purposes like a state or a nation, has its own government, its own army, its own navy, and its own laws. There were all of these states everywhere, many of them very remarkable for their culture.
Sparta dates back to the 12th century BC, a time of great change in the ancient world, when Egyptian power was waning and the Second Babylonian Empire was on the rise. According to Greek legend, Sparta began with violence and conquest, when in 1150 BC, invaders from the north, who believed themselves to be descendants of Hercules, moved south to reclaim what they believed to be their ancestral land. When King Lacedaemon took over the Central Peninsula, he named it Laconia after himself. He named the central capital Sparta after his queen. For nearly 400 years, until roughly 750 BC, Sparta was Laconia's religious, cultural, and governmental center. Art and music flourished.
Sparta is known for its beautiful choruses of singing women. The Spartans have a very attractive pottery that was traded. They were famous for bronze working.
These are very early examples of Laconian artistry. No fine art of Spartan origin has been found that dates after the 7th century BC. It's as if the people of Sparta just stopped making it.
The turning away from the kinds of visual arts that we see as prominent elsewhere is very clearly a self-conscious decision.
It was a decision that coincided with the greatest turning point in Sparta's history, a period known as the Messenian Wars. It began when a population explosion forced Sparta to seek new land and new sources of food.
They solved their problem by annexing an entire country which was both larger in population and territory than Sparta was. So that quirk of fate, that will change the course of Spartan history for the next 300 years.
The land they chose to take over was Messenia, a separate Dorian community directly to the west.
There's really nothing to make Sparta look absolutely strange and distinctive until the conquest of Messenia and its aftermath.
Messenia had rich farmland and a thriving agricultural economy. Today, it is where the famous Kalamata olives are grown. Messenia was also surrounded by rich stores of iron, Greece's most precious commodity for military equipment. Sparta needed Messenia, but the Messenians did not go quietly.
This was a long and hard war. The Spartans were not able to put down Messenian resistance easily or quickly.
The initial difficulty is simply topographical, getting over Mount Taygetos, which at its peak is 8,000 feet. But of course you don't go over the peak, you go round the side, and that means a detour, and that means marching a very long way. So you're very far from your base.
The people of Messenia were on their way to creating their own city-state culture. They resisted, they tried to remain independent, but the Spartans defeated them.
It would take nearly 100 years for Sparta to fully overtake the Messenians. But by the 7th century BC, Sparta ultimately controlled 8,000 square kilometers and became the largest city-state in the Greek Empire. The Messenians were forced to work the land as agricultural serfs called helots.
Helotage is a kind of tenant farming. A helot has a farm to which he must dedicate a certain part of every year's produce to a Spartan master. A particular Spartan master is in charge of each helot's farm, and yet the master doesn't actually own that helot as an out-and-out slave. He can't buy him and sell him.
No other city-state tried to enslave an entire Greek people. There's probably 250,000 residents of Messenia, and Spartan society is coalesced around 10,000 Spartiate warriors. So they're vastly outnumbered.
We ought to think of Sparta as a state under siege. In some sense, there's an analogy here to modern Israel. Now, of course, there are many, many differences, but the Spartans and the Israelis have this in common, that they cannot afford the luxury of giving up their security needs.
The situation called for the Spartans to remake their society from top to bottom. They developed new rules that would control every aspect of its citizens' lives.
They are the only Greek population that devotes itself entirely to the arts of war.
According to the Greek historian Plutarch, the architect of this new warrior city-state was a Spartan lawmaker named Lycurgus. Lycurgus reportedly traveled throughout the Mediterranean, gathering the best of military statecraft from Crete from Ionia, and from Egypt. He also received divine guidance from the oracles at Delphi, where it was said advice from Apollo was transmitted directly to him. With these new discipline guidelines, Sparta eventually transformed itself into a great militaristic society.
The armies, or the defenders in those days, were really just militias. They were just farmers taking down spears from above the fireplace and getting out there and fighting. Lycurgus, the original founding Spartan, so to speak, I think he just kind of said, hey, let's turn pro here. And then the whole society sort of unspooled from that decision, for good or ill.
His laws prevailed because they came with the authority of the Delphic oracle. And the oracle said that these laws should be obeyed as though they were divine laws.
Lycurgus may have been a man or the instrument of a legend. But in either event, the Spartans believed that it was Apollo's God-given wisdom that led them to create a master plan for Sparta. Their society was based on a pyramid of power. At the top were the roughly 10,000 men of the Spartan elite. They were called in Greek the homoioi, meaning the equals. In theory, each would have the same wealth and the same say in the government.
The goal was to make a society of equals, an army that could fight and where there would be no dissension, a polity that had unity.
Everything aims at homogeneity, similarity, if you will, and that is one of the keys to the Spartan system. We're going to have stability, we're going to have order, we're going to have obedience.
Below the homoioi were the roughly 50 to 60,000 free people who lived throughout Laconia, mostly on the outskirts of the capital city of Sparta. They were called the perioikoi, the dwellers around.
They allowed them to be independent, except that they couldn't make any political decisions. And they also compelled them to follow the Spartans whithersoever they may lead.
The perioikoi were essentially a non-voting middle class that kept the homoioi prepared for war.
The great bulk of the trade and the manufacturing, the craftsmanship that was necessary to maintain Spartan society, somebody had to make them weapons after all, was done by these perioikoi.
They were the engine that made it all work, because they freed the Spartan peers so that they had full leisure time to train athletically and every other way for war.
All pursuits not essential to the new Spartan machine were abandoned.
I think it's clear that one of the prices the Spartans paid for this solution to their problem was a cultural deprivation that they imposed on themselves. Because artistic creativity requires a degree of freedom that I think would have made them nervous.
At the bottom, and outnumbering everyone else, were the helots. The wives and daughters of the Spartan elite ran their households. This system left the equals responsible only to the polis, their Greek city-state.
They were willing to go to what turned out to be extreme measures to shape a state the like of which no one had ever seen before, and I suppose nobody has really seen since.
In the decades to come, Sparta would devise a new system of government that would control every citizen from cradle to grave. In the 7th century BC, Sparta was unique among all the several hundred city-states that surrounded the Aegean.
In every Greek polis, the state played more of a role in governing people's lives than many of us would accept today. Sparta went several degrees better. In no other city-state was the government as intrusive. This was a cradle-to-grave deal.
In fact, it was in the cradle that the first measure of the future Spartan equal was taken. At birth, government overseers examined each newborn infant of the elite to determine if he or she should be allowed to live. Less than superior infants were exposed, the Spartan euphemism for leaving an imperfect child to die in a mountain chasm.
This seems extraordinarily brutal, but the aim is to produce warriors. And so that's what they're looking for in these newborn children.
They needed good men. So I think that they would be unapologetic about the fact that they were breeding the best and strongest that they could.
Girl babies, too, had to be approved by the Board of Overseers, who decided whether they should live or be chucked off the edge of a mountain.
The surviving girls were raised to be mothers. The boys were raised to become Spartan equals, warriors who controlled the government. In Sparta, the government was by the people and for the people. If you were one of the homoioi, the equals, everyone else, the periokoi and the helots, were non-citizens.
The Spartans were uniquely successful in devising a unique system, let's say peculiar to them, that lasted for very many years, in fact so long that Machiavelli and others took it as a model.
At the top of the Spartan government was a hereditary monarchy with a strange twist.
The crucial starting point, which seems to be the most ancient part of their constitution, is they didn't have one king, they had two kings.
Now, this is really weird. Most Greek cities had a memory of a time when they had a king. And many Greek cities maintained a kind of religious official who sometimes kept the name the king. The Spartans, however, had two kings, and they had real authority in society. Certainly real authority to lead the armies, profound religious authority.
The reason for this is they serve as checks and balances on each other. They prevent any one man from becoming too powerful.
The dual monarchy and 28 Spartiates over the age of 60 created a council of elders known as the Gerousia. The Gerousia set policy and served as a supreme criminal court.
And Sparta was in some way a gerontocratic society. Old people ruled, and there were certain positions open only to old people. And one reason for that was if you survive to be old in a Spartan environment, you must be pretty damn tough.
Below the Gerousia was the Assembly of Citizens, which was made up of all Spartan equals over the age of 30. And was the least powerful branch of the Spartan government.
The Spartan assembly is not about deliberation. It is about, as it were, taking orders from people who have already decided the proper way for the society to go forward. The assembly is going to say, rah, rah, let's do it, when somebody proposes a policy.
Floating above it all was a board of 5 men called ephors, who ran the military, oversaw the educational system, and had considerable veto power over everyone, potentially even the kings. Their power was kept in check, however, by limiting their terms to 1 year and making them accountable to the assembly for their actions.
Those who serve as ephors or in other offices, at the end of their year in office, automatically go on trial. It's as if every president of the United States were impeached and put on trial at the end of his 4 years or 8 years in office and had to answer charges.
The goal of the Constitution was really to avoid allowing anyone or even any single institutional place in the society to become all-powerful. And I think that seems to have worked pretty well.
How could you get anything done with all of these people standing in your way? Well, the whole system was invented not to get anything done. Its purpose was not to change, to stop change. It did a terrific job of that.
In fact, for close to 400 years, Sparta had the most stable government in the history of ancient Greece. Yet it was anything but a democracy.
Freedom of the citizen is a core element of democracy, the freedom to speak out, the freedom to vote your conscience, and freedom of speech was not characteristic of Spartan society. The Spartans had no conviction that freedom was even a good idea. Freedom was simply not in the package of virtues that a Spartan was taught to respect.
Job 1 for the Spartan government was to keep control of the helots.
They knew the helots hated them, and as one Athenian who knew the Spartans very well once reported that the helots would gladly eat the Spartans raw.
So every year, the first item of business on the Spartan government's agenda was to declare war on the Helots.
And that was just sort of a formal way of saying any Spartan peer can kill any Helot anytime he wants.
Thucydides tells a chilling story about how the Spartans gave out the word that any Helot who thought he had done the best service for Sparta in the war should come forward to be freed. And some 2,000 came forward. And the Spartans put garlands around their heads to indicate their freedom. They marched them up to the temple, and they were never seen again.
In addition to maintaining the continuous formal war on the Helots, the government's main priority was legislating every aspect of life in Laconia.
They would do the same things every day. They would roughly marry in the same age period. They would dress alike. They would talk alike. They would act alike.
To ensure equality, the government created a system in which, in principle, no Spartan could be wealthier than any other Spartan.
If there was a great difference in wealth or in obvious creature comforts, it would be disastrous.
They forced the size of the farm that supported each warrior family to be perpetually the same size. And that is only possible if you destroy a market system. That meant there could be no money, there could be no open markets, there could be no exporting and importing.
To further eliminate the need for any kind of Spartan shopping spree, all households, by fiat, were designed exactly the same. Everything was functional, plain, and identical.
Spartan culture was austere. That's why we use the word Spartan. It can mean austere or tough today. In Sparta, it's really considered unacceptable for wealthy people to show off in the way that they dress. There is a austerity and equality, if you will, a lot of people wearing good Republican cloth coats in Sparta. Or if you think about the movement to have uniforms in our schools today, it's a similar sort of idea that clothes should not show inequality.
Even the speech of the elite Laconians was required to be austere.
The Spartans were trained to be men of few words. It matched the simplicity and the force of Spartan warriors.
Laconic speech is good for making snap decisions on the battlefield, but it's not good for sitting back and thinking about the big picture. And that's one of the big problems that the Spartans have.
To keep this system in place, Sparta's stand on foreign policy was equally laconic. Don't mix with strangers.
They didn't want anybody learning too much about Sparta, and furthermore, they didn't want Spartans learning too much about the rest of the world.
They wanted to preserve their customs. They wanted to preserve their nationality. And really, one doesn't preserve that by mingling with others.
Basically, they never left home. And on those occasions when groups of Spartans had to be away, connected with some military thing, for some period of time, they almost always misbehaved and went crazy because they simply didn't have any way of coping with that.
If all of these controls sound impossibly intrusive, they were. But government control over society was an accepted part of life in ancient Greece.
When the Greeks spoke about politics, they didn't only refer to a narrow constitution, a political arrangement. They thought that a regime was about the social arrangement, the cultural arrangement, the entire way of life. And we see this built into the Spartan system.
The primary means of indoctrinating Spartans into this new society would be an educational system that prepared 7-year-olds to become killing machines. The success of Sparta depended on a tightly controlled society. Over a 100-year period during the 7th century BC, Sparta invented and perfected the world's first system of social engineering. Control by the state began at birth. Inferior children were killed. Superior children were indoctrinated, trained, and molded into the kind of fighting force that could control the Helots, the enslaved people of Messenia.
Once you have a small population that must enslave a large population, then each Spartan, in the Spartan view, must be qualitatively superior to every 10 or 12 Messenians. The only way they felt they could achieve that level of military excellence was to bring all of the youths in a group, give them standardized training, and do it from a very early age.
When they were 7 years old, Spartan boys were taken away from home to be cared for and trained by the state. They lived in a kind of military academy called the Agogé.
At age 7, the young Spartan boy enters the world of males that really will be his life for the rest of his time, for as long as he survives. Initially, he is brought into what I have sometimes called the Cub Scout troop from hell.
The Agogé is 15 years long pep rally. The Spartans are being prepared to go into battle. And here an alleged saying of Patton comes to mind. Patton is supposed to have said to his men, I don't want you to kill for me, I want you to die for me. And that's the thing about the Spartans, they are ready to die.
For a Spartan boy's first 5 years in the Agogé, from age 7 to age 12, a government trainer-in-chief called a paidonomos instructed him in basic literacy and physical education. Discipline and punishment, however, were often meted out by slightly older boys.
The way to think about it is as if the toughest kids from your junior high school were put in charge of you when you just entered first grade. It is, I think, a system that, in a sense, uses the potential cruelty of children towards one another in order to try to teach this Spartan kid, from the very earliest age, that he has to absolutely obey every order that he is given from anyone who is a superior. It is a terrifying sort of vision.
The main lesson in the Agogé from day one was to toughen the boys for the hard life that lay ahead of them.
The Spartan training system was clearly meant to test for weakness and to cull out weakness. And throughout his life, a Spartan warrior had to worry about being watched by his fellow Spartans. They were constantly watching him for weakness, watching to see if he is really up to speed.
Again and again, the rule in the Agogé is, can you take it? How tough are you? Are you tough enough to be a Spartan male? This is a tough love system, and it's more tough than love.
Spartan girls also received training, but at home.
She was trained from childhood to be tough, to be physically fit at any rate, to be presumably to some extent self-reliant.
Because their raison d'etre was to produce strong sons to defend the community. They ate well, they participated in athletics, so they were, in a way, prime breeding specimens.
At age 12, Spartan boys entered the second level of Agogé training, and conditions got much worse. Each boy was issued a single cloth cloak. This was the only garment they were allowed to wear year-round. They were also required to go barefoot, all in the name of toughening them physically and mentally.
Anybody who's been to Laconia in the winter can see that the very idea that you would go barefooted or you'd have a single cloak would kill a modern American within minutes.
Tired and cold, the boys were also hungry.
Even meals were cooked, if that's the right word, by the helot attendants. And they cooked absolutely horrendous food, apparently. And the most famous meal of the Spartans is what's called the blood soup. It's basically pork, with a lot of blood floating around.
Travelers to Sparta were appalled at the Spartan diet. One famous description was recorded by a visiting Sybarite from the north.
He came to Sparta and he said, after sampling this soup, he now understood why the Spartans were so willing to die.
The soup was not only bad, there wasn't enough of it.
You get enough food to survive, but you don't get enough food to be happy. And so you're taught right away that if you want to get enough food to be happy, to feel full, you're going to have to steal it.
That was done in part to keep them sharp, but also in part to teach them survival skills, because it was all part of the business of making a Spartan, who would be the kind of guy who could manage to forage around the country and keep himself alive if he had to.
A Spartan child who is caught stealing will be punished, and yet a Spartan child who does not steal will be regarded as a complete wimp. If you are very good at cheating and you don't get caught, then you in fact will flourish.
The length one boy went to so as not to get caught was recorded by Plutarch. According to his account, a very hungry young boy stole a fox cub to eat. When a superior suspected he had stolen the fox, the boy hid the vicious little animal under his cloak. Rather than be found out, the boy let the trapped animal bite away at his flesh until he died.
This was taken throughout antiquity as an example of Spartan toughness. You know, that boy had been taught to be so unflinching, to deal with pain, to be respectful to his superiors. On the other hand, he was being eaten alive from the inside.
Toughening and strengthening Spartan adolescents was deemed necessary because of the kinds of battles they would one day fight.
The phalanx is as strong as the weakest link. So the crucial element is to make sure that everyone is more or less equally strong, and that those who are weaker are simply eliminated.
It was said of the Spartans that they were the only nation that when they went to war, things actually got easier for them.
Life in the agoge was a weeding out process. Boys were continually required to pass tests of strength, flexibility, endurance, and cunning. Failure was severely punished. At the annual festival at the temple of Artemis Orthia, Spartans would gather to watch a test that might be called the grab for the cheese.
The young men of Sparta divide into two groups. One group tries to steal the cheese that is piled up on the altar, and another group, armed with whips, try to prevent them from doing so. In that kind of melee, there are going to be occasions when people die.
Much of what young Spartan males were put through seems like a forecast of the most ominous aspects of modern fraternity hazings. And indeed, there were many Spartan boys who, when the tests were over, had not passed and had died.
It's a constant competition whereby everybody is being judged, graded in effect, and then there are winners who are given various advantages, various honors. So here's your Spartan. He is trained both to be like everybody else and to subordinate everything to the commonality and to be superior to everybody else.
To help guide them through their training, each Spartan boy was required to take a mentor, an older man whose association with the boy continued for life.
It was the responsibility of the mentor to watch out for a young boy that was in his care, to see that the training was proper, and to see that manners and character were also receiving appropriate attention.
Modern scholars debate as to whether or not the depth of their friendship included a sexual relationship.
In many situations in which women are excluded from participation, whether it's the military or whether it is something else, then I think the potential for even a homoerotic relationship is much higher.
The expectation was that any sexual relationship that may have existed when they were young would be ended at the point in which the boy becomes an adult, but it was expected to continue as a very, very close, tight friendship. And that web of friendships of people who had been mentors and mentees or lovers was part of the glue that kept Spartan society together.
So that any time the Spartan army was in battle, there would be men who had the closest possible relationship with each other of a personal kind, standing next to each other in the battle line, question of cohesion of units, of small units, is decisive in warfare. Can you imagine anything more cohesive than a unit made up of men of this type?
As a Spartan male grew older, he would be systematically introduced to two new and distinct, yet entirely practical experiences: marriage and cold-blooded murder. Sparta's legacy is that they not only created the idea of military discipline, but that they also perfected it through a social structure and a training program that began at age 7. By 20, most Spartan males graduated from the one system and entered another, one that would remain part of their lives until death. But before they could graduate, Spartan boys were put to one final test. The most promising students were selected to join the Crypteia, a secret security force dedicated to disposing of helots for any reason. Members of the Crypteia lived outside of Sparta, survived by their wits, and used the cover of darkness to cut throats.
The Crypteia could be regarded as a readaptation of a manhood ritual. We know of many societies where, in order to prove that you're ready to be a man, you have to achieve some particularly exceptional feat. But the Spartan version involves killing the enemy within.
The Crypteia then was a way for the Spartans to take their best and the brightest and use them to make life absolute hell for the people on whom the whole Spartan society was based. If you were a particularly handsome helot, if you were a helot who was known for agricultural innovations, if you were a helot who was thought to be in any way exceptional, you had to live in constant fear that the Crypteia would find out about how you stood out and made sure that you got dead.
After their term in the Crypteia, Spartan males joined small regiments of 15 men each. These units were called Suicidia, and they would be the Spartans' home for most of their lives.
So this is just an absolutely key moment. You had to be accepted into a regiment, and really everything you were doing up to that point leads to this moment of acceptance.
Although a Spartan's first duty is to his regiment, each man was also required to get married and produce children. To the outside world, this would seem to be a more pleasant aspect of Spartan life, since the women of Sparta were considered the most beautiful in the world. After all, Helen of Troy was originally a Spartan. But for Spartan men and women who had almost no contact with each other as children, courtship and marriage was just another form of duty to the state that carried with it some of the more strange rituals in Spartan society.
You're really almost dealing with two separate societies, and their courtship rituals seems to reflect this.
Marriages were arranged. There was no wedding ceremony. Instead, the nuptials took the form of a kind of ritualized abduction. The bride's hair was cut short, and she was dressed in a man's cloak. Then, the groom had to sneak into the house after dark in order to consummate the marriage.
That was the beginning of their marriage, their married life. Singularly joyless, I think, ritual, and very significant.
In fact, the only time newly married men were supposed to visit their own homes was after dark, with the sole purpose of impregnating their wives.
This was part of Lycurgus's law, to keep passion alive, and so make it harder for the lovers to get together, make it more of an adventure, you know, skulking away at night to meet in secret, and then as soon as they would consummate their love, the guy had to beat it back to his common mess, so that it was said that it was not uncommon for a Spartan husband never to have seen his wife in daylight until he was 30 years old.
You're talking about a very strange society when you think about these extraordinary checks on normal human impulses that were part of the picture.
The purpose of marriage, according to the city-state, was to produce children, preferably boys.
The only way a Spartan man can get his name on his gravestone is to have died in battle for Sparta. The only way a Spartan woman can get her name on her gravestone is to have died in childbirth.
Reproduction was so crucial, in fact, that Spartans went to extraordinary lengths to make sure women had as many healthy children as possible.
So we do have incidents, very strange incidents, where men invite younger men whom they think are better than they are to have relations with their wife with the idea that their offspring might in fact be better than themselves.
It is this kind of eugenic tendency, the idea that once you've got a proven Spartan, that proven Spartan should continue in the genetic line of Spartans, is absolutely at the center of their concerns.
All of these controls on marriage and family were designed to keep the men from being distracted from their main purpose, to drill and train, to terrorize the helots, and to uphold their own Spartan superiority.
Whether the Spartans really believed in their heart of hearts that they were uniformly men of virtue, or whether, in his heart of hearts, a Spartan thought, wow, I wish I could have a weekend in Athens every now and again and have some fun. We don't know. But what we do know is that the Spartans created a vision of themselves as completely content with their perfectly virtuous lives.
The great irony, however, was that even though they had the best trained military in the world, the Spartans didn't use it to fight other armies.
It's a magnificent military machine, but the attitude of the Spartans seems to be, let's not risk it. Let's not use it. Let's admire it. Let's polish those shields, but let's not use them unless we have to.
It was a system that worked inside Sparta remarkably well for 2 centuries. But then, for reasons that are not entirely clear, Sparta began to look outside its own borders for new people to conquer. Perhaps the war machine was in danger of growing rusty from disuse. Perhaps they were simply itching for a real fight.
The Spartans confidently thought that their 2 great adversaries, the Argives and the Tegeans, would be pretty easy to defeat.
And they're now ready to expand, as it were, to bring more territory within the same system.
At the same time, there was a real threat to Spartan supremacy on the horizon. A nation of more than 1 million warriors, hell-bent on conquering Greece. They were the Persians.
By the beginning of the 5th century, they're going to start first to conquer the Ionian Greeks in Asia Minor, and then to look toward the mainland. And that's going to explain all of subsequent Greek history for the next 2 centuries.